I work at a small convenience store on the edge of town. It's one of those places that's open 24/7, but the only time it's really busy is during the day. The night shift is a different story. Quiet, almost too quiet. My boss, Greg, offered me the night shift a couple of weeks ago, and I took it because the pay was better and I thought it would be easy. I thought wrong. It was my third night working alone when things started to feel off. The first few hours were fine, just like the other nights. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the flickering light in the corner that Greg swore he'd fix but never did, and the occasional car passing by were the only sounds I heard. Most nights, nobody came in after midnight, so I'd sit behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, waiting for my shift to end. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something strange. I was stocking the shelves in the back when I heard the chime of the front door. At first, I was relieved. A customer meant I wasn't completely alone. I headed back to the counter, but when I got there, no one was inside. I stepped outside, looking around the empty parking lot. Nothing. No cars, no people, just silence. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the door was just malfunctioning. It was an old building after all, and the wind could sometimes push the door just enough to trigger the chime. But the night was calm, no wind at all. I went back inside, locked the door, and returned to stocking the shelves. A few minutes later, the chime rang again. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but again, the store was empty. This time, I felt a chill run down my spine. I walked up to the counter, staring at the door for a moment. Something didn't feel right. I checked the security cameras, but they showed nothing. The door was closed. No one outside, no movement inside. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, almost like someone was standing right behind me. I froze, my hand hovering over the counter. Slowly, I turned around, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I checked the back of the store, every aisle, every corner, no one. But the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered. My heart was racing now, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was watching me. I went back to the counter, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the quiet of the night was playing tricks on my mind. But then, the lights flickered. It wasn't the usual flicker from the broken light in the corner. This was the entire store. The lights dimmed, then went out for a second before flickering back to life. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, and the air grew cold. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 2:45 a.m. I still had hours left on my shift. I thought about calling Greg, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. It was probably just a power surge, I told myself. But then I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was clearer, closer. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty store. Silence. I grabbed a flashlight from under the counter and started walking toward the back of the store. My hands were shaking, and the beam of light wobbled in front of me. I checked each aisle again. Every shelf, every corner. Nothing. As I turned to head back to the front, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. It moved quickly, disappearing behind the shelves. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly walked toward where I'd seen the shadow, flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispering grew louder now, more urgent. It sounded like it was all around me, but I couldn't make out the words. I turned the corner, shining the light down the aisle. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the aisle, tall and dark, its face hidden in the shadows. It didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there staring at me. I froze, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The light flickered as it hit the ground, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, but the figure didn't move. I ran to the front of the store, grabbing my phone to call Greg. My hands were shaking so much I could barely dial the number. As the phone rang, I glanced up at the security cameras, and my blood ran cold. The figure was gone. "Greg, you need to get here," I said as soon as he answered. "Something's wrong. There's someone here." "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Greg replied, his voice calm, like he'd heard this all before. I waited, every second feeling like an eternity. I kept my eyes on the door, half expecting the figure to appear again. The whispering had stopped, but the cold air remained, sending shivers down my spine. Finally, Greg arrived. He walked in like nothing was wrong, his usual casual demeanor intact. "What's going on?" he asked, looking around the store. I told him everything, the door chime, the whispers, the figure. But when we checked the security footage, there was nothing. No door opening, no shadowy figure, nothing. Greg shrugged. "Probably just your imagination. These old buildings make weird noises at night, don't worry about it." But as he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong with this place. That night, as I locked up and headed home, I glanced back at the store. Through the window, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching me. I quit the night shift the next day. I always thought working the night shift at the old hospital would be easy. I was a nursing assistant, and I had heard stories about the place, but I didn't believe them. The hospital was quiet at night, and I figured it would be just like my last job, calm and boring. I was wrong. It was my first night shift, and I arrived at 11 p.m. The hospital had an eerie feel to it, with its long hallways and flickering lights. I grabbed my badge and made my way to the nurse's station. The head nurse, Margaret, was sitting there, sipping coffee. "Welcome to the night shift," she said with a tired smile. "You'll get used to it. Just keep an eye on room 312. We have a patient in there who's, well, let's just say he's a little I nodded, thinking it couldn't be too bad. "What's wrong with him?" Margaret's expression turned serious. "He talks to things that aren't there. Just be cautious." As the night wore on, I settled into my routine. The hours passed slowly, and I often found myself lost in thought, staring at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard a strange noise, a low whispering coming from the end of the hallway. I glanced up, looking around. The halls were empty, but the whispering continued, growing louder. I shook my head, trying to ignore it. Maybe it was just the wind, or my tired mind playing tricks on me. I decided to check on room 312. The door creaked as I opened it, and I stepped inside. The patient, Mr. Thompson, was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. His eyes were wide, almost wild. "Mr. Thompson?" I asked, trying to sound reassuring. "How are you feeling tonight?" He turned to me slowly, a strange smile spreading across his face. "They're here, you know." "Who's here?" I asked, my heart racing. The shadows," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They watch me. They want me to join them." I forced a smile. "You're safe here, Mr. Thompson. Just try to rest." But he shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. They'll come for you too." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'm just here to help you. You need to calm down." Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting shadows on the walls. I stepped back, feeling a rush of fear. "I'll be right back. Just stay here." I hurried out of the room, closing the door behind me. The whispering grew louder as I walked away, echoing through the hall. I reached the nurse's station, trying to shake off the unease. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked, looking at me with concern. "Mr. Thompson. He's acting strange. He keeps talking about shadow." Margaret frowned. "He's not the first. Some patients can sense things we can't. Just keep an eye on him. He's harmless." I nodded, but my heart was still racing. I tried to distract myself by checking on other patients. Most were asleep, and the quiet of the hospital was unsettling. But every now and then, I heard the whispers again, drifting through the air like a ghostly presence. A few hours later, I returned to Mr. Thompson's room. As I entered, I noticed the shadows seemed darker, stretching across the walls. Mr. Thompson was sitting up, his eyes wide and terrified. "They're coming," he shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. "You have to help me. They want me." I stepped back, feeling panic rising in my chest. "Who wants you? I'm here to help." The shadows," he cried, pointing towards the corner of the room. "They're right there." I glanced over, and my breath caught in my throat. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a dark figure lurking just beyond the edge of the light. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Mr. Thompson, please, calm down," I pleaded, trying to keep my voice steady. He fell back against the pillow, his face pale. "You don't understand. They can't take me if you're here." I stood frozen, unable to move. The whispers swirled around me, growing louder and more urgent. I wanted to run, but I felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath in the air. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in terror as he began to scream. "They're here! They're here!" he shouted, clawing at the sheets. "Help me, please!" I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Someone help!" I yelled, but my voice felt swallowed by the shadows. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The whispers intensified, now sounding like frantic voices calling my name. I banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. I could feel the darkness closing in around me. "Get out!" Mr. Thompson shouted, his voice breaking. "You have to leave." Just then, the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. I felt a cold breath on my neck, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. I could hear the whispers now, surrounding me, pressing in on all sides. "Join us. Join you." In a panic, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the door. I could see the shadowy figures in the corners of the room, writhing and swirling like smoke. No, get away!" I screamed, my voice echoing in the darkness. I ran to the door and pounded on it with all my strength. Finally, it burst open, and Margaret was standing there looking shocked. "What's going on?" she shouted, rushing inside. The moment she stepped in, the shadows shrieked and retreated, disappearing into the corners of the room. The lights flickered back on, and the room returned to normal. "What happened?" she asked, looking at me with concern. "Mr. Thompson." He was screaming. "The shadows." I stammered, still shaking. Margaret frowned, her eyes darting to Mr. Thompson, who was now lying back down, seemingly calm. "Just another episode," she said quietly, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I glanced back at Mr. Thompson, who now had a knowing look on his face. "You should have left when you had the chance," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away from the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching me, waiting for the next chance to strike. I finished my shift but never returned to that hospital. I couldn't forget Mr. Thompson's eyes or the whispers that haunted me long after I left. Some nights, I still hear them, calling me back to join the shadows. I started working at the small gas station on the outskirts of town to make some extra money. It wasn't the kind of place that saw much traffic during the day, let alone at night, but the pay was decent, and I figured I could handle a few quiet shifts. The locals called it the graveyard shift, and I thought it was just because of the late hours. But after my first night, I realized there was a lot more to that name than I expected. My shift began at midnight and ran until 6 a.m. The gas station was old, with a flickering neon sign that barely lit up the road. There was a single street lamp in the parking lot, casting long, creepy shadows over the pumps. Inside, the place was dimly lit, with shelves of snacks, a counter, and a fridge that hummed loudly in the back. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I heard the first sound. A soft, scraping noise from outside, like something was being dragged across the pavement. I looked up from behind the counter and stared out the window, but the parking lot was empty. Just the usual stillness of the night. I brushed it off and went back to scrolling through my phone. Maybe it was just a stray animal or the wind. This place was isolated enough that anything could be making noises. 15 minutes later, the noise came again. This time it was louder. I stood up, peering through the glass doors, but I couldn't see anything. The street lamp flickered, casting eerie shadows across the parking lot. I thought I saw something move near the edge of the light, but it was gone before I could focus on it. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Around 2 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. A customer had walked in. He was tall, with a worn-out jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His movements were slow, almost unnatural. He didn't say a word as he made his way to the back of the store, his boots thudding heavily on the floor. I watched him from behind the counter, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Something about him didn't sit right with me. He moved too stiffly, like he wasn't quite used to his own body. After a few minutes, he came back to the front, carrying a single bottle of water. He placed it on the counter, and I rang it up. "That'll be $1, I said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me with blank eyes, his face shadowed by the cap. I shifted uncomfortably, waiting for him to hand me the money. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, placing it on the counter with a shaky hand. I gave him his change and watched as he left without another word. The bell above the door jingled again as he stepped out into the night, disappearing into the darkness beyond the street lamp. I breathed a sigh of relief once he was gone, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I tried to focus on my phone again, but I couldn't shake the memory of that man's blank stare. There was something wrong with him, something I couldn't explain. About half an hour later, I heard the scraping noise again. This time, it was right outside the door. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing the flashlight from under the counter and stepping outside. The cold night air hit me as I scanned the parking lot with the beam of the flashlight. The light flickered slightly, and I cursed under my breath. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and my instincts were screaming at me to go back inside. But I forced myself to walk around the side of the building, where the noise had come from. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched low to the ground near the trash cans, its back to me. It was dressed in tattered clothes, its arms long and twisted. The scraping sound came from the creature dragging something across the pavement, a long, rusted piece of metal. "Hey!" I shouted, taking a step back, my voice shaky. "What are you doing?" The figure stopped moving. Slowly, it turned its head toward me. The beam of my flashlight flickered over its face, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones. It grinned at me, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The figure let out a low, raspy laugh, its body contorting in unnatural ways as it rose to its full height. It towered over me, its limbs long and twisted, its movements jerky and unnatural. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back toward the gas station, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps behind me, dragging the piece of metal as it followed. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, locking it just as the creature reached the glass. For a moment, we stood there, staring at each other through the door. The creature pressed its face against the glass, grinning at me with those horrible, jagged teeth. It raised one of its long arms and scratched at the door with the metal, the sound sending chills down my spine. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling. The creature didn't move from the door. It just stood there, watching me, grinning that terrible grin. I grabbed my phone and called my boss, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. "You need to get here," I said. "Something's outside. It's not human." My boss laughed. "You've been listening to too many of the local legends. It's probably just some drunk. Stay inside and they'll leave." I hung up, my hands still shaking. I knew what I saw wasn't human. I could feel it deep in my gut. The creature continued to scratch at the door, its hollow eyes never leaving mine. After what felt like hours, the scratching finally stopped. I slowly approached the door, peeking through the glass. The creature was gone. I spent the rest of the night behind the counter, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. The gas station was dead silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching, waiting. When my shift finally ended, I bolted for my car, glancing over my shoulder the whole way. The parking lot was empty, but I couldn't relax. I drove home as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I quit the graveyard shift the next day.